Well, we're live here with Whatley from Actionable Insights, and as part of our three questions with a pro, which is something that we'll get into, you guys participated in releasing this Silica Exposure and the regulatory evolution of that. So that's definitely something I wanted to touch on. But a question I always like to ask is, how did you get into the restoration industry? I've met very few people that ever, were in high school wanting to be a part of restoration or even knew what it was. So what was your introduction and what's been your experience over the last couple of years?
Fair question. Yeah, nobody has like a straightforward path to
Right.
restoration, right?
Yep.
So I am no different. I did a stint out of college in private equity,
Oh,
and that became a bit wobbly as an outcome of the financial crisis, right? And so
okay.
the largest PE firm in Southern California actually went tits up, and I had worked my way up
Wow.
to chairman. I was deputy to the chairman and CEO. But even in that role, like at some point, there was nothing to chair.
Yeah.
And so we wound that firm down. And so I was able to escape with a few dollars in my pocket, a little severance. And I'm like, okay, so what do I know? Um, well, I wasn't a particularly wealthy kid growing up, John. So what do you do? While
Yeah.
everybody else is like going on vacation, I was out in the trades, right? I always worked for general contractors. So I
Okay.
worked for an electrician for a year and a half. I worked for a flooring contractor for a year and a half, and I worked for two GCs. And this was, I was especially involved in like a bunch of ADA, American Disabilities Act stuff that
Oh,
came through in the late 90s when I was going through high school and college. So while everybody was serving at TGI Fridays, I was a project manager for a GC.
wow.
And so I'm like, okay, so I know how to build. Okay, that's interesting. And I thought about it like very much from a PE perspective. I was like, okay, what is totally recession proof? Because I was harmed so violently
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
the Great Recession, right? I was that perfect age of just like, oh, I was on top of the world and now I'm nothing. So it's like, I want something that's totally recession proof. So I was looking at the insurance ecosystem. I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, so I know something about how to build, and I know that property insurance have some attractive characteristics and
Yeah.
a great recession. We're going to find out how true that is right now,
Yeah.
it would appear. Um,
The quote unquote
and-
recession proof work.
yeah, you got it. So I think like a lot of us, my dad's friend had this, he was a carpet cleaning company, and like he
Okay.
was floundering, and then I was floundering. I was out of work, and my dad's like, hey, maybe you can provide some advice and help him clean up his finances. So I
Yeah.
came in there to like clean up his finance, and I started looking around. I'm like, God, there's kind of a lot of gross revenues here. It's like a
Yeah.
bunch of dollars, right? But he couldn't net. There's a bunch of fish, but he couldn't net them.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
maybe I can help this guy out. And so I came in as a consultant, and really it got down to he couldn't pay me the way that we had set out to
Okay.
pay, but we were working together well. And so instead of taking pay, I took equity, and I did that for years. And
Oh,
so I ended up with just under majority share of a company that we together grew to just under $10 million a year in gross
wow.
revenues. So just fortuitously kind of ended up in the restoration ecosystem. And I can remember like a lot of us probably on this call, like grinding it out in a garage with no
Yep.
HVAC on my one laptop, just going climbing in attics and doing it
Yeah.
all. So that's how we got here. But that was my road to restoration, so to speak.
Yeah. And then, so obviously you intersected with Xactimate and all the tools of the trade and whatnot. So what birthed Actionable Insights then? And did you say that started in 2013, 2014?
Yeah. So what we were finding, I was so grateful for some of these adjusters. Scott Black comes to mind. I mean, these seasoned pros have been doing this for 20 years. If you approach them with the humility as a contractor, these adjusters, like, I really don't know
Say
how to,
that word again.
humility, like
What?
it's not something that I'm often probably known for at this point in my career. But I think at that point, it was very evident. I didn't know what I was doing, right? And you had nothing to fall back on but
Sure.
humility.
Yeah.
And so I would approach these adjusters, and like I remember coming to Scott, and he was with Farmers back then, and now he's with NatGen as a national training manager, and actually on the board of Actionable Insights, no doubt.
Oh wow.
But
Full
he,
circle.
Yeah, full circle. But he would be such a good steward. He'd be like, "All right, Whatley, like you're billing for upper cabinets when it should be lower cabinets, and don't forget your toe kicks and right." Da, 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 da. And I'm so grateful for that. But I watched as KIC grew and my role evolved. How there seemed to be like a we-they dichotomy emerging between us as the contractor
Yeah.
and the carrier, and that didn't it seemed abnormal to me, John. So in order to get more in tune with that and get closer to like what was going on the ground, I invited 30 of my fellow competitors out to my warehouse, and we from the outset like we're thoughtful enough to not do anything anti-competitive or anything that could be regarded as price fixing. Price was always off the table, but we did talk about scope, and we're like, hey, what line items are you guys using for a shower surround? What line
Oh,
items are you guys using for removing glue down flooring, right? What's working, what's not working.
collaborative.
You got it. And what was weird is I think 90 days into that, we were doing it once a month. State Farm came out. And so
Wow.
several of the staff adjusters came out and then they spoke to us about the hot button issues. The next
Yeah.
month, Liberty Mutual came out and they spoke to us. Then Nationwide Private Client came out. And so
Beautiful.
they were providing guidance for Southern California about like, hey, this is what we'd like to see. And frankly, guys, hey, we'd like to pay your bill, but if you can put it in this format, then this can be approved without hesitation. And so we just had a group. We would get together in groups of over 100 for
Oh,
years and
wow.
like just make this happen. And
Yeah.
we would just do it. And it was a weird hobby that I think my business partner didn't really love at KIC because it was a big drain of resources.
Sure.
But I just saw the wisdom of like, hey, the rising tide raises all boats. And although it's
Yeah.
cliche, it rang true to me then and it does now. But it was always a hobby, buddy, until we brought on one of our farmer students who basically coerced me into hiring him. He was the first employee. We didn't really have employees. It wasn't really a thing. We had just filed our 501c6
Oh, damn.
nonprofit status. And he's like, man, I want to work for you. And I'm like, oh, no, okay, sure, man. So we hired him at like next to nothing. And like he went off in a direction such that he wanted to write a book, the Insight Sheet database and or really what was the Umpires Mitigation Manual, Umpires Repair Manual. And so he sat down with me, and for 10 months we just wrote, and
Wow.
that turned out to be the kid that took it from a hobby to a business. And
To a
he's been
business.
really, yeah, dragging me along uh, all this time. And I've been off. I've sold KIC all this time, and then I'm focused on my contents side of the business with Emergency Packout Co. and our
Yeah.
pods business, emergency storage. But he's just been pulling me back into Actionable.
That's
But
awesome.
he's a hell of a talent, and he's really made it happen. And I think he finds the work very fulfilling, which
Yeah.
it's really refreshing to see.
Well, and so you guys, you have the Xactimate training, and as far as like innovation goes, like Matterport, and then you have your treasure trove of digital assets there at Actionable Insights. Um, and I guess this would be part of that paradigm, the white paper. The thing that kind of grabbed my attention. So at 9 to 5, we do asbestos abatement, and that often intersects with silica exposure. Um, it's funny. I can remember when I got into the industry, we had contemplated starting an asbestos division, right?
Yeah.
But we thought, well, in theory, you're working yourself out of a business because you're actually. It's not like mold where it's ubiquitous and it's always going to come back.
Yeah.
Asbestos, in theory, there's a limited amount of
It's
it
fine.
out there, and we
That's right.
can get rid of it, but we still haven't tapped that bottom yet. Um, One of the interesting things about silica is it's in everything. And so, um, when you go to the asbestos trainings, you see how at the factories, nobody was wearing respirators. There was no dust suppression, no water suppression, no capture systems, those kinds of things. And obviously that led to a lot of, I mean, the element itself causes problems, but the environmental controls around the industry were incredibly low, and obviously there's a lot of lawsuits about whether that was known or unknown.
Yeah.
Um, but in modern day, we see that the same thing. You walk by a construction site and somebody's cutting into concrete, whether it's with a handsaw or a walking behind saw, and there's just this plume of dust, right? And so anything, this isn't necessarily from a verifiable source, but I was talking to somebody that has friends that work in coffee, and they're having the same thing there. If you're exposed to excessive amounts of dust of anything, right,
Yep.
and not wearing respirators, no environmental controls, no dust suppression, it's going to cause problems, you know.
Yep.
So it's almost like we do this to ourselves if we're not putting people in the proper PPE. So I guess that's maybe the question I wanted to ask and pose to you when I reached out was, what kind of drove um, writing this paper? And you partnered with Kevin Hussey out of United Fire and Water and Rachel Stewart from Titan Restoration.
Hmm.
You know, what kind of led to writing the paper, and what were you seeing even pre, that led to writing this?
Well, around the time when we set out to write this, NPR was just starting to launch some stories
Yeah.
around silica, its exposure, some folks that were really sick with silicosis. Some of those that have been most effective actually worked in granite prefab
Yeah.
countertop, right? And they're
In the
cutting it
fix.
all
Yeah.
day in
Yeah.
a warehouse and they're just tore up. And that's now we're recognizing the folks in the field that you and I are more familiar with, even
Yeah.
miter cutting that or making a cut for a uh, bottom mount sink. There's nothing dustier. I can remember coming into job sites with homeowners that were pissed because all
Yeah.
of their cabinets, and I can just remember
Yeah.
opening up a sink drawer and it
Yeah.
just being buried with the silica dust
Super
from
fine. Yeah.
super fine, right?
Yep.
Um, and I remember going, whoa, and I wasn't wearing probably the adequate PPEs because as sensitive to asbestos as I was, I had actually pursued my DOSH license. I actually got my DOSH license
Huh.
and earned that after $30,000 in consulting fees and a year and a half of filing paperwork. Also got it revoked 2 weeks later,
Oh,
which is an
geez.
interesting segue. We did nothing wrong, but this is like bureaucracy at its finest. The state of California issued something that you couldn't have a DOSH license unless you had a C22, but you couldn't sit for the C22 unless you had a DOSH license.
Oh, geez.
I actually flew to Sacramento twice to help develop the test for the asbestos test, and they wouldn't let me sit for the test that I helped create.
Oh,
So you can imagine
wow.
the scathing email that I sent to the powers that be
Yeah.
when I got my license revoked for doing absolutely nothing. But
Yeah.
that's bureaucracy at its finest. Here's the point, John. Um, I myself didn't know that silica was awful
Yeah.
for us. I exposed myself and probably unknowingly a lot of my team members over the years to silica. Probably not in fantastic amounts because I was never in the granite business, but
Right.
by auxiliary, it certainly happened. We were good about it whenever we were cutting drywall, but we were less cautious when we were cutting granite. And I always
Sure.
took a certain amount of pride in keeping my team safe. I took a certain amount of pride in restorer and billing to keep my
Yeah.
team safe, but
Yeah.
I really went out of my way to make sure that hey, this personal protectment it exists for a reason. We can bill for it, use it, so on,
Yeah.
right? I didn't think about silica. So I thought it was my obligation as somewhat of a steward of the industry to go, perhaps we should put this thing together. So out on Xactimate Ninjas, which is one of the Facebook groups that's owned by Actionable Insights, there was a lot of talk around silica at that time. And so Kevin Hussey brought up, hey, Whatley, I want to write a white paper.
Yeah.
Rachel Stewart, she is the editor in chief of Actionable Insights. So
Oh, wow.
everything that's published and like formal she reviews and proves and so on. She's an amazing writer, a real talent.
Yeah.
And so we just came together to knock this thing out. So Kevin did a lot of the copy, and then Mateus Abundanza, he did a lot of the design work under my direction.
Yeah.
So those
It's a
vectors in
slick.
there are pretty sexy, right? Like
Yeah. Yep.
we
Very slick.
put a lot of time into that. Just because we wanted to visually represent,
Right.
how large those silica particles were, because I think that's how a lot of my students have traditionally learned, right? And so I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of make that jump off the page for them that this is real. And so now to see that the cases are flowing about silica exposure and those with silicosis and alike, I feel like we were a bit out ahead of it. And I think this is going to become a larger and larger issue, John. I think that asbestos might even be a bit overblown in North America. Chrysotile asbestos rarely leads to um, mesothelioma, right? Maybe asbestosis, but those are straight barbs. They're not like tricytile that are the curved barbs out of Australia. The blue stuff what'll really take you out, but nobody wants to make an argument over this level of asbestos or this kind of asbestos is
Sure.
safe or not, but at least we're aware of it. With silica, I don't think a lot of us were aware of it. And so I'm
Yeah.
grateful that we got that out there. We got people thinking about it. And then when we published an update to the glue down flooring insight sheet, for diamond grinding, I think we did some great work there at
Yeah.
Actionable Insights, because that's when you're exposed to a lot of friable. Uh, Somebody out there is going to be like, well, that's not friable, or whatever. I don't know. But when you're diamond grinding, you're exposing a lot of silica, right? Any reasonable person would agree to that.
Everything. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And so we smoothed the way for some guidance for how would you invoice for a reasonable amount of PPEs, right?
Mm.
On a repair side, because I think paying for PPEs on a repair estimate is like, we're
Yeah.
not paying for,
Can't be.
well,
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think that we helped with the white paper, like, here's the guidance around it, here's the
Yeah.
regulatory environment, and then here's how to bill for it. And it also helped solidify our relationship with OSHA. So OSHA has been speaking at actionable events for the last 5 years,
Well,
and OSHA pushed us to publish that as well. And so we
well,
were in direct collaboration with them. They didn't want to be named on it. It got like really complicated
sure.
with if they were named on it, but we did our very best to check in with them along the way. And they have been enforcing in Southern California quite a bit. So, I mean,
Yeah.
issuing fines. So it's
Yeah.
definitely real for restorers in California. Several of those in our network have been actually fined for silica exposure.
Well, that's what I was listening to another podcast on the topic and looking through your report as well. It's like 675,000 workplaces or something like that, and are affected because it's so prevalent. It's in
Hmm.
sand, metal, cements, and glass, ceramics. So almost any surface you're cutting into, it could be present. Um, but it just, I guess, maybe in transitioning to, there's an issue. Who knew N95 mask would be in such demand, and Tyvek suits and gloves would be hard to find, right? I mean, it's like toilet paper, right? Just 2 weeks ago wasn't even a thought, and now
All right.
it's in short supply. Um, we've seen one conversation I was part of. People are saying, "Hey, if you have N95 masks, give those to the medical field, and then use your full face respirators, half face respirators." And in my mind, that might be one of the positive outcomes. I've long been a proponent, sounds like you are too. Your full face respirator protects your face, your eyes,
Mhm.
and your lungs all at the same time. I don't know why we wouldn't be, whether we're sending people into fire cleanups or just on your standard cleanup if you're doing demo. I'm not sure why we have adverse, and I know some people have the objection that it's, well, it'll scare the client. But if you have a conversation with them, hey, I'm exposed to this a whole much more than you are. This
Mhm.
protects my face, protects my eyes, protects my lungs. What are you seeing? Kind of um, the cool thing about Actionable Insights and what you're doing, it all ties into innovation, training. Obviously, Silica touches on a huge point of safety. We need to educate ourselves and get ahead of it. In the post-COVID or the current COVID situation, how are you seeing those things kind of come together with innovation, training, and safety?
Well, I think we're going to have to grow up as an industry. We're going
Yeah,
to have to recognize that we have a great responsibility to each other, our fellow restorers, our fellow
yeah,
ownership, and to our employees. And if we want to be around in 20 years and we intend to be solvent in 20 years, it's really important that we protect our people.
yeah.
We can learn from the mistakes from the other industries who didn't take these exposures seriously when people at the highest ranks of the industry kind of knew there was a problem,
Right.
right? But they didn't necessarily take meaningful action. Well, that's gone really poorly for them, right?
Yeah,
And so we can only assume that the daytime television 15 years from now is going to have a bunch of personal injury attorneys talking about silica exposure.
yeah,
Shame on us as restorers if we can't get out ahead of this
Right.
and protect our people. Shame on carriers if they can't pay for reasonable PPEs in
Right.
a restoration environment.
Right.
And if I'm a claims manager at the highest levels, and I'm really grateful for where I'm at in my career now, is that I do have exposure to C-level insurance executives. A lot of them do understand that some of their very real exposure, the billions of dollars,
Yeah.
is the personal injury exposure for systemically denying reasonable PPEs. And so I
Yeah.
think a lot of carriers are wising up at the highest ranks of like,
Right.
yeah, we probably don't want a systemic pattern of not paying for any PPEs, because it's only a matter of time before those personal injury attorneys really realize where
Yeah.
the money is, because they can chase after the contractors all they want, but really the deep pockets are on the carrier side.
Yeah.
And if they can prove a systemic pattern, then that would be problematic. And I think that we can look from what failed in other industries and just connect the dots
Yeah.
moving forward pretty easily.
Yeah.
That I think carriers and stores need to grow up quickly and just protect our folks. And like you're saying about just wearing the full face mask, that's why I moved to at KIC. That's what we use at EPC. It's the North 5500 with
Yeah.
the full P100 vapors, because so often we're exposed to chemicals that we're introducing into the environment anyways.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I don't want a situation where somebody's administering an EPA registered chemical that the P100 isn't capturing and they think it is because it's just
Yeah.
the HEPA. So we just said straight away, everybody gets their
Combo.
mask, right? Their combo. It goes in a little toolbox, right? It's got their
Yeah.
name on it. They get fitted every year,
Yeah.
and you can set it and forget it. And that's the way I love to approach it. And those full faces, like in terms of safe and permissible amounts, from what I remember for cubic centimeter, like per actual fiber, I think it's an order of magnitude less than even a regular piggy nose. It does a much better job, provided you
Yeah.
don't have an awesome beard like yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the full face 5500 is the way to go. And when you're billing a carrier like a buck 90 a day for it, like why in the world can't they just get some reasonable relief for
Yeah.
that? It just doesn't
Well,
make
and you have an
sense.
obligation as an owner to protect, increase your knowledge, right? Reach out to these kinds of resources and educate yourself, and then especially, once you become aware of it, then act on it. And then um, groups like yourself and like RIAs, AGA, where there's collaborative advocacy for getting appropriate pricing. I mean, it calls more than ever for us to work together to say, hey, these are reasonable things that we need covered. It doesn't, if it's not being paid for, it doesn't excuse your responsibility to it. And then yeah,
But
try
I
to.
shouldn't interject, John, that there is a big distinction between actionable and what the AGA is doing.
Sure.
Actionable has to this really fine line, because our board is made up of even primarily carrier professionals and really credible restorers. We have to give equal credence to both sides. And so when we're advocating on behalf of our membership, maybe with the pricing department at Xactware, et cetera, we are bringing forth line items that provide some value to both sides of
Sure.
the claim, right?
Yep. Yep.
And we never touch pricing. You'll never see us deal with pricing straight away. So we like to communicate in terms of scope and line items, but we leave it up to the other powers to be, because there's no way that we or myself can advocate as it relates to pricing and not put
Yep.
myself in a precarious position with
Yeah.
my current employer, or with my board membership. How could
Yeah.
I represent the interest of both, right? But when
Yeah.
we see something where there's an impasse in the claim continuing to emerge, or hey, the adoption of this particular line item
Yeah.
would likely help manage overarching severity but provide some relief in the immediate term for contractors doing the right thing,
Yeah.
those are the line items that we explore. But what the AGA is doing, I don't want to comment on as an Actionable Insights representative. I just want to say, good, bad, and different. It's a very different approach and perhaps necessary, but it deviates pretty fantastically from the mission of Actionable Insights.
Sure.
Is that fair?
Well, and I think more. My comment was hopefully speaking to collaboration, right? The origins of Actionable Insights, as far as you guys meeting together and saying, hey, this is what we're doing, this is how we're approaching it,
Right.
these are best practices. And I think you guys are continuing that with your digital assets, and then things like the Silica Exposure paper, which are educational in nature, right? And more best practices.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's our give back, buddy. Those are free. We just like to
yep.
get those out
Yep.
there. We are publishing one, every 6 months or so, but they take a lot of work.
Yeah.
But Rachel and I do enjoy turning out that content, right? And
Yeah.
making sure we're thinking about the right things. But
Yeah.
I'm glad that you picked that up, that spirit's coming through, like with no
Yeah.
particular bias. We're like, hey, this seems real,
Yeah.
and this is the regulatory environment around it, and here's how one might react to it.
Yeah.
So
You have to
I like
take.
to think that we've gotten a lot more people thinking about silica than
Yeah.
they were 18 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think like you mentioned, people are actually facing cases of it, right? And you're hearing of actual legal being brought against restorers specifically,
This
or
seems contrived, but an hour and a half ago, my business partner showed up in my office, and he sat right at that desk to my left, your right, and
yeah,
he's like, "Yeah, so we just got subpoenaed." I'm like, "Oh God, like what is this, right?" And I took a certain amount of pride. Like, I never sue anybody. I don't
yeah,
have these problems like with
yeah,
seeing through liens, and so I'm like, "Why are we getting subpoenaed? Like, what the hell is going on?" It's like, actually, it's not a bad thing, at least for us. So a flooring contractor, well known in California, not that doesn't serve the restoration ecosystem as much as they're on TV and they kind of serve like regular residential, right?
yeah.
Um, we did emergency pack out co. Did the pack out for in preparation for the flooring to be replaced.
Okay,
When they did the flooring, they diamond ground the slab, as I was mentioning earlier, and they dusted out the entire property.
okay.
And although that was just annoying to the policyholder, it became especially an issue when two of the kids came down
Oh,
with silicosis. And so they are still dealing with that. They're now asthmatic, so on. It's a problem. And so they filed suit against that flooring contractor. And
wow.
since we did the pack out, we got subpoenaed and so on for, they want the Matterport tours that we've done. Emergency Pack Out Co. fortuitously does a pre-mitigation and post-mitigation scan on every loss. So we actually have a 3D rendering of the property before and after,
What
right? And
contents were prior to, and
hmm
nice, very nice.
and so that is going to be helpful, and actually, it's really elegant for us to hand that
Yeah,
over to the attorneys and like, here you go, guys,
yeah,
and we continue to host those for our clients for perpetuity as part of our value proposition. So it was nice that we were just able to hand that over, and here's our scope of work, and done deal. So we don't have a particular relationship with the flooring contractor,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So we're just kind of like, here you go. Um, but very interesting that you and I have this meeting today. And
yeah,
then just an hour and a half ago,
yeah,
he's like, Whatley, dude, we just got subpoenaed, knowing that nothing about you and I meeting,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So for anybody watching this, very real, right?
yeah,
Just hit
yeah,
me as a restorer. Like,
yeah,
luckily, I'm not at the tip of the spear here, but
yeah,
involved in a claim. And that's going to be, I mean, it's a 7-figure claim, right? This is a big
yeah,
deal, and perhaps it should be. So I think they were probably just laborers out there doing their thing, working under
yeah,
somebody's direction, nobody thinking about it. But the days of behaving that way, certainly in California,
yeah.
it's totally irresponsible. Like, and
Well,
the chickens are going to come to roost.
I'm sure plenty of people think, well, that's just California, but we all know as California goes, it tends to trickle down. So, um,
Hmm.
but
For
just
good or for bad.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
It'll take 24 months before it hits Mark Springer in Montana, but it will happen, Mark. Mark my words, buddy. It comes for you.
well, and it speaks to, I think that's, it just speaks to all in all being proactive and innovative as far as it comes to, protect, understanding the information that's available and protecting your employees, and then figuring out ways to continue to provide value and to, extract value for um, both setting yourself apart and then, doing the work properly. Um, I like how you said, I think you said offline, you had a quote where, the origins of Actionable Insights was diverse perspectives with shared objectives,
Right.
and I think that, hopefully that's a part of what our industry's, understanding the value in altogether. I mean, our origins are all independent entrepreneurs, but if we can share pieces of the puzzle, then, we have a much better perspective of how to move forward. Um, so I guess as we wrap up, you've been super generous with your time. Is there any other closing comments that you'd like to share with the group?
John, thank you for the forum, first of all.
Yeah.
But I think I'd wrap up with this notion. Not only is it our responsibility, if I'm to put on my restorer hat, and I've got a couple of them, but if I put on my restorer hat, it's not only a responsibility to protect our employees, and it's not our responsibility to invoice it. It's really also our obligation to all the materially interested parties, be it the
Yeah.
policyholder, the staff adjuster, the TPA analyst, to explain the why behind it and do
Yeah.
that patiently and do that with a spirit of education. So, when I train, I don't train towards this we they dichotomy and like
Yeah.
this is how you fight and this is how you win, right? We've eliminated that kind of terminology from our curriculum, and really we like folks to really take responsibility for mastering the contents of that curriculum. Don't just know that Whatley and Hussey wrote some white paper, right, that
Yeah.
Rachel approved. Like, read
Wow.
it.
Here it
Like,
is.
right,
Yeah.
read it, right? Like,
Yeah.
read it,
Yeah.
know it, be able to refer back to it in your emails or elegantly off the tip of your tongue on a phone call, right?
Right.
That's what it takes. That's mastery. And that's when you're educating. And that's when you can remain calm, right? And display that mastery of an idea. And that's when I found that you can get paid without hesitation.
Huh.
And that's what it means to be a restorer in 2020. In 2002, all you had to do was really swing a hammer and
Yeah.
write up a yellow pad that said
Yeah.
$18,768 restoration activities. But that
Yeah.
doesn't work in today's environment.
Yeah.
And so it's our obligation to really master these nuanced topics and really bring them to bear in an educational format. And I find that the results are consistently compelling.
Yeah. Well, we always like to say, tell the story of the loss, right? So you got to understand what you're getting into and then be able to. The storytelling medium is typically Xactimate, so you got to learn the
Yep.
language, right, and speak it eloquently. So you mentioned there's the Umpires Mitigation Manual, the Umpires Repairs Manual, and then those are broken down into segments.
Yeah, they're books. Don't buy the books. They're really expensive, and they're expensive for Harrison to print. So whatever you do, don't buy the book.
You guys have basically broken those down into insight sheets, right? That's
Yeah,
your insight database.
for
Yeah.
$7 a month, you can have access to 3,700 pages of invoicing templates. And so it
Yeah.
shows the line item and it shows the why behind it. And we
Yeah.
bring to bear maybe 150 years of restoration experience of like, this is why the line item was created and this is how you
Yeah.
can justify it given the scenario. And here in the 16 named perils, why the consequences damages might respond to this particular activity. And so we just provide guidance around why one might invoice that for that, be it an IA, be it a staff adjuster, or be it a contractor. It was written with no particular bias. I guess the bias was to just give equal credence to omissions as well as excesses and overages. And I think that's
Yeah.
what nobody ever did before. That was
Yeah.
perhaps a refreshing approach. It's
Yeah.
not written with any particular bias.
Yeah, that's it. Again, I mean, I love that line, diverse perspectives, but shared objectives. And a big proponent of collaboration and figuring out how we got to build something sustainable directed towards that goal. So, man, I appreciate you, Whatley, for sharing your time with us. And hopefully this will be the first of many conversations. So,
I like it. I had fun. Thanks for having me on.
all right. Thank you.
All right, John, be good.